Hey guys, it's the holiday season, so I decided to reach into my bag of goodies and unleash a few gifts upon you listeners. What you're about to listen to is an episode from my exclusive podcast series that can be found at my YouTube membership over at the Pacific War Channel on YouTube or at my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/The Pacific War Channel. Now, before we jump into it, I just want to say a big thanks to all of you who've been listening to me for so long. All of you guys are awesome. And hey, it's the holiday season. If you're looking for a last-minute gift idea, consider tossing a YouTube membership or a Patreon membership to a history-loving family member or friend. Stating all of that, let's just jump right into it. Hey, before I begin, I just want to thank all of you who have joined the Patreon. You guys are awesome. Please let me know what other figures, events, or other things you want to hear more about in the future, and I'll try and make it happen. So as you can see from the title of this episode, why did the Japanese perform so many atrocities during the Pacific War? Yeah, this is going to be a difficult one to tackle, for there are countless reasons as to why. When I was back in university, I had a professor who taught ancient and modern Japanese history, history of the Japanese Empire, and the Pacific War. He actually answered this very question in a single lecture, and in many ways I found it to be one of the most illuminating things I had ever learnt about the Pacific War. To truly understand the reasons why they did such horrible things, you actually need to learn a bit more of the general history of Japan, particularly the changes from Tokugawa to the Meiji era and then to the Showa era. I'm going to try and do my very best, but I know many of you might be asking, what were the worst things they did? Not everyone takes a special interest in such a niche part of history. May I recommend for those with strong stomachs this book called The Knights of Bushido by Edward Russell. It covers, I think, pretty much all the atrocities of the Asia-Pacific War. And for those of you who like things even darker, check out Unit 731, Japan's Secret Biological Warfare in World War II by David Wallace and Peter Williams. That is absolute nightmare fuel. The reason I bring up these two books is I simply can't dwell too far into all the atrocities. This episode would take far too long. And it's not really the purpose of the episode. The purpose is for me to explain why they're occurring. I also can't go through the entire history of Japan, but I think it's important to start off with the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. We're going to take a quick little look at some of the history before the Pacific War because it really sets the table as to why things are occurring. So this was the first time the Empire of Japan fought a true war with a foreign nation, that being the Qing dynasty. At this point in time, there really emerged a sort of, to be blunt, race war. The Chinese had historically referred to the Japanese as Woren, a racist term meaning dwarf. Now, historically, the Japanese had always revered the Chinese, kind of like in the way a little brother looks up to his big brother. In Tokugawa Japan, they would learn from the Chinese. But as the Meiji Restoration began, this dramatically changed. Japan watched as China was being humiliated and abused by Western powers, and failed to modernize. Meanwhile, Japan emulated the very best of the West, to modernize and become a great world power themselves eventually. In many ways, Japan saw itself become Big Brother, and now China was Little Brother. The Meiji Restoration had an element of nationalism also built into it, and it would explode come the Showa era. Japan, for its entire history, had this belief they were the Yamato race, dating back to the 6th century. Now, while the Meiji Restoration sought to emulate the West, they also emulated some racism and propaganda, which in the 19th century was kind of a big deal. The Japanese government gradually began a long-term campaign promoting the idea the Japanese, or Yamato people, were superior to that of the other Asian races. Who was the next big Asian boy on the block? Well, China. It was inevitable they would direct a lot of racist attitudes towards the Chinese. During the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese, particularly the Manchu, had a habit of performing atrocities upon the Japanese. They would often cut off body parts of Japanese soldiers in grotesque manners and leave them to be found by their comrades. This was honestly a pretty typical thing of war in the region, but it also did have a racist element to it. At this point in time, the Chinese certainly saw the Japanese as a lesser people. Just prior to the Battle of Port Arthur, the Japanese found mutilated remains of their comrades. Here is a passage from Makio Okabe, who was there to see it. As we entered the town of Port Arthur, we saw the head of a Japanese soldier displayed on a wooden stake. This filled us with rage and desire to crush any Chinese soldier. Anyone we saw in the town we killed. The streets were filled with corpses, so many they blocked our way. We killed people in their homes. By and large, there wasn't a single house without from 3 to 6 dead. Blood was flowing and the smell was awful. We sent out search parties. We shot some, hacked others. The Chinese troops just dropped their arms and fled. Firing and slashing, it was unbounded joy. At this time, our artillery troops were at the rear, giving 3 cheers, Banzai, 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 for the Emperor. The Japanese performed a massacre at Port Arthur, butchering perhaps up to 3,000 Chinese civilians. Some claim tens of thousands, and in full view of Western war correspondents. It became a huge controversy that destroyed the image of the IJA internationally and hurt the Japanese government's efforts at ridding themselves of the unequal treaties imposed upon them by Western powers. The Japanese learned a hell of a lesson, and an imperial proclamation was made in 1894 stating the Japanese soldiers would make every effort to win the war without violating international laws. According to Japanese historian Yuki Tanaka, Japanese forces during the First Sino-Japanese War released 1,790 Chinese prisoners without harm, once they had signed an agreement not to take up arms against Japan if they were released. During the next major war, the Japanese performed a dramatic 180. Well, at least to their enemy. During the Russo-Japanese War, over 80,000 Russian POWs were held by the IJA, who were treated in accordance with the Hague Conventions of 1899. The Japanese paid them for their labor, housed them in conventional POW camps, made sure they received good medical treatment, ironically better than that the Russians were even capable of. The Japanese did all of this, making sure the foreign war correspondents wrote about it. It was a massive PR stunt in many ways. The Japanese were emulating how a world power should act, because they sought to be one. Meanwhile, the Japanese swallowed their pride at being called yellow monkeys, as the prevalent yellow peril ideology was being pushed by Kaiser Wilhelm and the Tsar Nicholas II heavily. The Japanese treated the entire war like gentlemen, and they would suffer higher casualty rates for it. But something many people don't take much notice of, because the IJA made sure of it, was the horrible treatment upon the Chinese during the war. Now, the Russians in Manchuria looted, killed, and raped many Chinese, pushed quite a bit by the Yellow Peril. The Chinese, certainly the Honghuzi bandits, were working for the Japanese to attack them, so it's not like they didn't have good reasons. The IJA was much more professional and had orders not to molest the Chinese, as they were helping the war effort, but this did not prevent it. The Japanese also looted, killed, and raped Chinese. The Japanese would often wave it off as reprisals against potential spies. I found some estimations that maybe 20,000 Chinese civilians were killed during the conflict. I only bring this up as it was very apparent the Japanese treated the Russians much different than the Chinese during this war. If we fast forward a little bit, we go to World War I, where the Japanese had a battle against the Germans and Austro-Hungarians known to the West as the Siege of Tsingtao. The Japanese took an identical methodology to the Russo-Japanese War with their approach to fighting the Germans, but they even took it a step further. After winning the siege, the Japanese seized nearly 5,000 German POWs, who were treated with a surreal amount of respect. They were brought back to Japan and housed for the rest of the war in 12 cities around Tokyo and Kumamoto. The POWs enjoyed humane treatment, and a rather famous event occurred at the Bando camp, where a large orchestra was formed of German POWs who toured the entire nation performing 100 concerts, lectures, and plays. Evidence the Germans were treated very well can be seen by the fact 170 prisoners never left Japan and sought wives and lives there. Now, is this all a feel-good love story? No. Just like during the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was playing up the PR. For during World War I, they wanted official recognition as a world power and that of being racially equal to whites. Japan was officially recognized as a world power during the Treaty of Versailles. But when Japan presented its racial equality proposal, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States and Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes refused to allow it to pass, even though it received majority votes. Now, the Japanese had been, for a lack of better words, fucked over. During the First Sino-Japanese War, there was the Triple Intervention of France, Germany, and Russia, who stole away their earnings of the Liaodong Peninsula. During the Russo-Japanese War, Theodore Roosevelt, from the perspective of the Japanese, limited their war gains. Or hell, as they would have said, he literally stole victory from them. And now, after World War I, the Japanese received another huge humiliation. They were told that they were indeed a world power like the rest, but not racially equal. There is, of course, other historical racist events going on, like the Gentleman's Agreement that limited immigration of Japanese to the United States. Over in Australia, there was the whites-only immigration policy, also humiliating the Japanese. And all of these events combined proved to the Japanese the West, particularly the whites, would never treat them equally. The end of World War I would actually drive Japan towards World War II. Now we're going to fast forward quite a bit in time, straight to the Showa era, and we're going to get right into the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the year of 1937, Japan and China had entered an unofficial war that saw one of the worst wartime atrocities in human history occur. You know it was coming up. It's the rape of Nanjing. It began on December the 13th of 1937. It lasted for 6 or so weeks, seeing the murder of possibly 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war, the mass rape of possibly 20,000 women, and untold horrors upon the Chinese people. The Japanese would follow this up with numerous other massacres in China, such as the Zhengqiao massacre, claiming possibly 30,000 Chinese civilian lives, the Alexandria Hospital massacre, killing 200 patients and medical staff in Hong Kong, the Laha massacre on the Ambon Island, where 300 members of the Gulf Force were executed, the Bangka Island massacre, where 60 Australian and British soldiers, alongside 22 Australian nurses, were murdered, the Parat Sulong massacre in Malé, where 150 wounded Australians and Indian POWs were executed, the Bataan Death March, where negligence and brutality took the lives of 650 Americans and perhaps possibly 18,000 Filipinos, the Manila Massacre, claiming the lives of perhaps up to 54,000 Filipinos, including women and children, the Balikpapan Massacre in the Dutch East Indies, taking the lives of 78 Dutch civilians, and I could just keep going on with this. I really mean, the list does go on. Wherever the Japanese went, wherever they occupied, massacres and horrors would occur. And again, if you really want to delve into those stories, check out the book, The Knights of Bushido. The Japanese also had infamous special units like 731, who conducted horrifying experiments on civilians and POWs, such as cutting open people alive without anesthesia, testing biological and chemical weapons on live people, the horrifying freezing experiments where they would freeze people, causing massive amounts of frostbite, just to see what people could survive. They gave people sexually transmitted diseases to study. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii's Unit 731 deployed plague-infested fleas, cholera, bubonic plague, and other nasty weapons upon Chinese civilians, killing perhaps 500,000. This was seen during the Battle of Chengdu and famously during Operation Seigo, also known as the Zhejiangjiangxi campaign. The Japanese also enacted the infamous Sanko Saksen, 3-alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. This was done in retaliation to the Chinese Communist 100 Regiments offensive in December of 1940. It was personally sanctioned by Emperor Hirohito, and it is thought that this act resulted in the death of 2.7 million Chinese civilians. According to the author Werner Gruhl, 8 million Chinese civilian deaths could be attributable to the Japanese. So that kind of tackles a bit of the history, what occurred. But why did it occur is the actual question of this episode. There is simply no way for me to tackle every single variable present. There are hundreds. But I tried to break it down into 5 neat little subjects, we'll call it. Or I guess it's better to call it 5 whys. Number 1, treaties signed or not signed. Number 2, war strategy and indoctrination. Number 3, ultranationalism and racism. Number 4, surrender and the bastardization of the Bushido Code. And number 5, the brutality of the Japanese military. So number 1, treaties signed or not signed. Yes, it's time to talk about treaties. I know, yawn. Now, I said previously, Japan did sign the Hague Conventions of 1899, and they would ratify them in 1907. The Hague Conventions did contain laws for how to treat prisoners of war and how to protect the lives of civilians. Alongside this, in 1894, an imperial proclamation was made stating Japanese soldiers would make every effort to win a war without violating international laws. But more significantly for this story, Japan signed, quote-unquote, but unlike the majority of other world powers, did not ratify the Geneva Convention of 1929. Why? To be blunt, the Geneva Conventions did not really benefit the Japanese military from their point of view. First, the Japanese had a very specific perspective on surrendering. They simply did not do it. So, they did not expect many of their soldiers to ever become POWs. So, how would it benefit them to ratify such a treaty? If they are not going to be having many POWs, why would they burden themselves with upholding all the conventional laws for POWs that they would obtain during the war? Another rather glaring reason involved aerial bombing. Many Japanese leaders, like Kanji Ishiwara, believed the home islands would be subjected to massive aerial bombing if a global war was to break out. If Japan was subjected to aerial bombing and ratified the Geneva Convention, this meant they would have to take all the pilots they caught prisoner. The Japanese believed this would encourage further bombing. Lastly, the convention had rules for POW treatment that literally contradicted how Japanese soldiers were treated by their own superiors. More about that in particular later on. That'll be for part 5. But to just summarize, the Japanese army was abusive as hell, and to sign such a thing would literally contradict how things were done. It would look pretty awkward if you treated your POWs better than your own men. Emperor Hirohito personally ratified a decision to remove certain constraints of the Hague Conventions when it came to the treatment of Chinese POWs in the directives issued on the 5th of August 1937. This notification advised staff officers to simply stop using the term prisoners of war for the Chinese. They would refer to their enemy as bandits, guerrillas, and such. Anything but soldiers, so they would not have to take any prisoners, though they did typically not leave much Chinese alive whenever they attacked an area. The Geneva Convention exempted POWs of the rank of sergeant and higher from manual labor, and stipulated that prisoners performing work should be provided with extra rations and other essentials. The Japanese in the later half of the war would be starved of provisions and resources, thus it's to no surprise they could not meet these demands, even if they sought to uphold them. I will note, in 1942, Japan indicated that they would, quote-unquote, follow the Geneva rules, and would observe the Hague Convention of 1907 outlining the laws of customs of war. Yet, this is like a verbal confirmation. It had no legal basis, something the Japanese particularly loved to do during war. According to Dr. William Skelton III, who produced a document entitled American Ex-Prisoners of War for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, more POWs died at the hands of the Japanese in the Pacific Theater, and specifically in the Philippines, than in any other conflict up to that date. For example, in Germany, POWs died at a rate of 1.2%. In the Pacific Theater, the rate was 37%. In the Philippines, POWs died at a rate of 40%. That is ridiculous. But I would be lying if it was all abuse. To be honest, the reason why so many died was because of starvation. Japan did not have enough food to feed itself. Now, these pieces of paper that were signed or not signed, what does this really matter when it comes to war? It's obvious they were not upholding certain rules, but how did this quote-unquote make them more brutal and perform more atrocities? Well, here's the sticky thing. If you are part of the Japanese military, and you know your nation did not ratify certain rules of war, this meant your enemy had no supposed legal basis to follow said rules against you either. So I want you to think of two aspects of this. If your nation did not sign or ratify certain treaties, then you could not expect the enemy to respect such rules when it came to you. But more importantly, what if the leader of your nation just told you to believe that? In early 1942, Great Britain and the United States of America and other great powers did officially let the Japanese government know they would, on their part, observe all the provisions of the convention, and requested reciprocity. Japanese Foreign Minister at the time, Hideki Tojo, gave a formal assurance that although Japan was not bound by the Geneva Convention, the Japanese would apply it mutatis mutandis towards the Americans, British, Canadians, Australians, and New Zealander POWs. He specifically did not add any Asiatic groups to that list, nor the Dutch, as I now can see. I guess he must have forgot about the Dutch, which is sad. Everyone forgets about the Dutch in the Pacific War. But this did morally bind Japan to comply with the convention. However, the top brass of the Japanese military, notably Hideki Tojo in most cases, would go out of his way to instill beliefs within the military as to what they should expect from the enemy. As you will see in the next points, this was basically a type of indoctrination. Thus, number 2, war strategy and indoctrination. The leaders of Japan knew full well how unmatched they were in terms of resources and productivity before the war had even begun against the West. How could Japan possibly win such a war? The IJN was dead set on a decisive naval battle, but for the IJA to compensate for their lack of resources, they believed their spirit would overcome the enemy. And what does that mean? What is, quote-unquote, the spirit? In many ways, this spirit meant going above and beyond normal human endurance, to literally outperform the Allies, and notably, to conduct the war with absolutely zero mercy. Once Japan lost the initiative in the war, after the Guadalcanal campaign, the IJA were forced to fight a war of attrition. Their strategy became prolonging and exacting maximum casualties upon the Allies, hoping to force them to the peace table. The idea was quite simple. The IJA would do everything possible to make the Allies believe they would never give up and that it would be far too costly to defeat them. I guess you could say it's the age-old, "I'll take you to hell with me." How does one go about achieving this, though? Well, the IJA officers would tell you, by stealing your hearts. To achieve all of this required extreme indoctrination. Japanese children grew up in regimentation. They were desensitized to violence through tales of martial glory. They were taught that their purpose in life was to serve the emperor. Upon entering military service, they were trained out of any individualistic spirit, and they were taught that compassion was weakness and it had no place in the field of war. The soldier's motto was faith equaled strength, faith being devotion to duty and service to the divine emperor. Apart from ideology and spiritual toughening, training in the Japanese Imperial Army was extremely harsh and violent. This was not even particularly a special aspect of Showa Japan. It went all the way back to the Meiji era. From a young age, children's education directed them like a pipeline for military service. Basically, what I mean by that is all school children were taught things of war. They all had a certain mentality as to how war should be conducted, and the government made sure it was quite brutal. Now, at the offset of the war, Hideki Tojo released the Senjinkun. These were instructions for the battlefield. It was basically a manual for soldiers on how to conduct war. The document was used to establish standards of behavior for Japanese troops, and to improve discipline and morale within the army. It also included things like prohibition against being taken prisoner. It stated if you were captured by the enemy, because Japan did not sign or ratify certain treaties, you would be killed or tortured by the Allies. And if you survived, you and your family would face shame back home, and punishment resulting typically in 6 months prison. Here is a small excerpt from the document. Those who know shame are weak. Always think of preserving the honor of your community and be a credit to yourself and your family. Redouble your efforts and respond to their expectations. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor. The purpose was basically psychological warfare against their own army. Those like Hideki Tojo believed Japan could only defeat the resource-rich Americans with spirit. Thus, the manuals like Senjinkun demanded the forces never ever surrender, because the Allies would do horrible things. It was shameful to do so, and there would be disciplinary actions for those who did. In 1942, the Army amended its criminal code to specify that officers who surrendered soldiers under their command would face at least 6 months' imprisonment, regardless of the circumstances in which they surrendered. This change attracted little attention, however, as the Senjinkun imposed more severe consequences and had greater moral force. In a report dated June 1945, the U.S. Office of War Information noted that 84% of one group of interrogated Japanese prisoners, many of whom had been injured or unconscious when they were captured, stated they had expected to be killed or tortured by the Allies if taken prisoner. The OWI analyst described this as being typical, and concluded the fear of the consequences of surrender, rather than bushido, was the motivation for many Japanese battle deaths in hopeless circumstances, as much as, and probably more than, the other two major considerations, fear of disgrace at home and, quote, the positive desire to die for one's nation, ancestors, and God Emperor. Something else barely talked about in the West about the Pacific War was the American tendency to take human trophies. These human trophies were typically Japanese skulls, gold teeth, sometimes finger bones and such. The famous novel With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge spoke of his personal accounts of seeing these actions. It's a rather gruesome and dark part of the war. Now, some of these actions were publicized, despite the U.S. military's best efforts to quell and hush it down. Time magazine famously had an iconic photo of a woman whose enlisted boyfriend sent her home a gift, a Japanese skull. Also, FDR famously was given a letter opener carved out of Japanese bones. These stories were seized up greedily by the Japanese government, who used them as propaganda to prove to their soldiers what would happen to them if they were captured. It had a profound effect, as you can imagine. And this was not only limited to Japanese soldiers. The propaganda machine would contribute at the end of the war to the mass civilian suicides seen at Okinawa and Saipan. Now, back to the subject of prisoners of war. When it came to the treatment of POWs, Hideki Tojo began submitting in May of 1942 a series of memorandum, basic orders as to how to treat POWs. Prisoners of war can be used for the enlargement of our production and as military labor. White prisoners of war will be confined successively in Korea, Formosa, and Manchuria. Superior technicians and high-ranking officers, colonels and above, will be included among the prisoners of war confined in Formosa. Those who are not suitable for use in enlargement of our production will be confined in prisoner of war camps, which will be built immediately on the spot. Although the working of prisoner of war officers and warrant officers is forbidden by the regulations of 1903, the policy of the control authorities is that under the situation of our country, where not one person now eats without working, they want them to set to work. It is desired that you give proper orders on this. The present situation of affairs in this country does not permit anyone to lie idle, doing nothing but eating freely. With that in view, in dealing with prisoners of war, I hope you will see that they may be usefully employed. In Japan, we have our own ideology concerning prisoners of war, which should naturally make their treatment more or less different from that in Europe and America. In dealing with them, you should, of course, observe the various regulations concerned, aim at an adequate application of them. At the same time, you must not allow them to lie idle, doing nothing but eating freely, for even a single day. Their labor and technical skill should be fully utilized for the replenishment of production, and contribution rendered towards the prosecution of the greater East Asiatic War, for which no effort ought to be spared. Thus, in the end, as a grunt in the IGA, you were led to believe, if I am captured, I will be tortured, killed, maybe even turned into a letter opener, or someone will place my skull on their mantle. If I surrender, and I survive, and I make it back home, I will severely be punished, and worst of all, my family will be shamed. I could not expect any humanity from the enemy, because my nation did not sign or ratify treaties like the Geneva Convention. More so, because my army's conduct was so unbelievably barbaric, I could only expect the very same from my enemy. It was a vicious cycle. You perform atrocities, expecting the enemy to do the very same thing, and thus it just keeps perpetuating itself. So now we're coming up to part 3, ultranationalism and racism. Now before we spoke a little bit about the concept of the Yamato race. The Japanese were indoctrinated to believe that they were a superior race and that their emperor was something akin to a living god. Until this war, the Japanese Empire was on a hell of a winning streak, going all the way back to the Meiji era. For the first half of the Pacific War, the Japanese won nearly every battle. This led to something historians called victory disease, that made them become somewhat arrogant and a bit too cocky, but it also made them feel like superhuman. The Allies' news reporting at the very beginning of the war began to frantically refer to the Japanese soldier as supermen, or super jungle fighters. Particularly because of the Malay campaign, the Japanese soldier just seemed to be tougher. He could survive harsher jungle climates, even doing so with less food or war materials. The Japanese would read the Allied news reports, and they came to the conclusion that had been driven down their throats by their government. Indeed, the Japanese spirit was winning the war. The Japanese public ate their government's propaganda up, and it perpetuated their ultra-nationalistic beliefs. The Japanese truly came to believe they were destined to rule over the Asia-Pacific. Look at the results in China, for example. Within just a short amount of time, they had conquered much of China, though the public really had no idea how bad the China War had bottled down by 1940. Then came the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere propaganda, which is an excellent example of their megalomania. Yet alongside their ultranationalism, which was more strongly perpetuated against other Asian groups, the Japanese also indoctrinated their public with racism against them. The Yellow Peril of the 19th century and anti-Japanese or just anti-Asian racism fueled the Japanese soldier. The Japanese as a people had faced brutal racist hardships historically at the hands of the West, particularly from their viewpoint of America. There were slights against them during the First Sino-Japanese War, the infamous triple intervention of France, Germany, and Russia that stole away their prized Liaodong Peninsula. Then during the Boxer Rebellion, they faced racism, not being allowed to lead the multinational army formations despite being the lion's share of the said military force. The Russo-Japanese War saw from their point of view America stealing their war prizes. And last but not least, after World War I, they were told straight to their faces that they were a world power but not racially equal. The Japanese faced anti-Japanese and anti-Asian immigration laws when it came to America in the form of the Gentleman's Agreement, and then with Australia with their Great White Australia policy. During the war, American propaganda began to pump out racist caricatures of Japanese as rats, google-eyed, buck-toothed people, literally yellow monkeys. For the IGA, the Pacific War, in many ways, was a holy war directed at the arrogant whites who had abused them for so long. This will probably sound controversial, but indeed, the Pacific War was very much a race war. Now, if you're not convinced of that, I do recommend reading one book, War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War by John Dower. John Dower certainly did a good job compiling just about every inch of that concept during the Pacific War. The human trophy taking, for example, was not seen so much in Europe. There weren't too many German skulls in anyone's mantelpieces, just as an example. Anti-Japanese buck-tooth-looking people, rat people in the cartoon propagandas, just the yellow monkey stuff. I mean, you can look and Google this at any point. There was also the internment camps for the Japanese in America and Canada. We did not see the same thing happen to the Germans or Italians. There was, of course, the Gentleman's Agreement, the stealing of victories during the First Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, and World War I that I had mentioned numerous times at this point. All of this plagued the mind of the Japanese soldier. To them, in many ways, the whites had it coming, as you would say. Now, of course, this is all rather ironic, given how the Japanese would treat the other Asian racial groups that they came into contact with. But such is the contradictory nature of the Japanese military. The Japanese also held racist beliefs about Westerners. The Japanese soldiers were taught that the Allies were akin to demons or beasts. They were told rather silly things like that Western men were afraid to fight at night or in the rain. Thus, the Japanese specifically trained for night fighting. They would describe them as the hairy ones or the Anglo-American demons. They were taught these men would rape women and girls, stample upon civilians that they had captured with the treads of their tanks. The American Marines were especially dreaded. According to a story circulated widely among the Japanese on Saipan, all the Marine Corps recruits were compelled to murder their own parents before being inducted into service. I can't help but think of that scene in the famous series The Pacific, when the commander tells his men that he's reading a note from the Japanese. I think it's supposed to be from Hideki Tojo. And I've looked it up many times, the quote, and I couldn't find confirmation if it had ever been said, but it went something along the lines that Hideki Tojo was telling the men that the Marines were either prisoners let out of prison or those let out of insane asylums to fight the war. It was said that Japanese soldiers taken prisoner would suffer hideous tortures. Their ears, noses, and limbs would be cut off. They would be blinded and castrated. They could be cooked and fed to dogs. As silly as that may sound, do remember the Americans were taking human trophies, so for Japanese propaganda purposes, they did have evidence. Tons of photos of skulls atop American tanks, for example, were displayed to the Japanese public. Another famous one was the cartoon appearing in an American serviceman's magazine, which was later reproduced and translated into the Japanese press. It suggested the existence of Japanese hunting licenses, promising open season on the enemy, complete with free ammunition and equipment, with pay. In terms of how the Japanese exacted their own racism towards their fellow Asians, during the war, the Japanese dragged into forced labor Koreans, Chinese, and Southeast Asians. 670,000 Koreans were brought to Japan to work the mines and the heavy industry. Around 60,000 of them would die to harsh conditions. Between April of 1943 to May of 1945, 41,862 Chinese were sent to Japan to work. 2,800 of them died before even reaching the home islands. 6,872 would die in the work sites, again from brutal conditions. When it comes to Southeast Asian numbers, they're a little bit harder to pinpoint, but it's safe to say at least 300,000 Javanese, Malay, Burmese, Tamil, and other groups were mobilized to construct the famous Burma-Siam Railroad between October of 1942 to November of 1943, and 60,000 would perish. This all went for the men. For the women, all those racial groups would face the horrors of becoming comfort women. Historians estimate there could have been 50 to 200,000 who were pressed into this. But for the Japanese, believing they were superior to those other Asiatic groups whom they would publicly say were like their children, they as the father figures would guide, well, they simply abused them. It's rather dark and ironic that the racism perpetuated against the Japanese, and Asians in general, would be employed by the Japanese upon the other Asian groups, because since the Meiji era, they had been emulating the West. Most likely from their point of view, it was completely normal. So in a contradictive fashion, the Japanese believed that they were superior and could do horrible things to their Asian neighbors, while simultaneously decrying the racism cast towards them by Western powers, as justification for their brutal actions against them. These types of feelings and perspectives molded the mind of the average Japanese soldier. Dehumanizing others had always been a standard military practice after all. And now we're coming up to number 4, surrender and the bastardization of the Bushido Code. I think this is one the vast majority of World War II history buffs know. The Japanese perspective on surrender and that of their famous Bushido Code. In the book, Military Trials of War, Criminals in the Netherlands East Indies, 1946 to 1949, Fred Borch had this to say about the variable of Bushido for the brutality. As Japan continued its modernization in the early 20th century, her armed forces became convinced that success in battle would be assured if Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen had the spirit of Bushido. The result was that the Bushido code of behavior was inculcated into the Japanese soldier as part of his basic training. Each soldier was indoctrinated to accept that it was the greatest honor to die for the emperor, and it was cowardly to surrender to the enemy. Bushido therefore explained why the Japanese soldiers who were stationed in the Netherlands East Indies so mistreated POWs in their custody. Those who had surrendered to the Japanese, regardless of how courageously or honorably they had fought, merited nothing but contempt. They had forfeited all honor and literally deserved nothing. Consequently, when the Japanese murdered POWs by shooting, beheading, and drowning, these acts were excused, since they involved the killing of men who had forfeited all rights to be treated with dignity or respect. While civilian internees were certainly in a different category from POWs, it is reasonable to think that there was a spillover effect from the tenets of Bushido. It is very true the Japanese soldiers and sailors were taught Japan was a sacred nation. Traditional samurai values of Bushido were merged with modern training and weaponry. The government propagandized the figure of the emperor as a living god, who embodied the Japanese state, the Kokutai. Emperor Hirohito and his family were the spiritual essence of Japan. To even show your back to the enemy, let alone surrender, was deemed cowardly and brought dishonor upon your family. As written by Inoue Jukichi in 1910, something read by many Japanese, the Japanese warriors looked upon it as shame to themselves not to die when their lord was hard pressed. Their own shame was the shame upon their parents, their family, their house, and their whole clan. And with this idea deeply impressed upon their minds, the samurai, no matter of what rank, held their lives light as feathers, when compared with the weight they attached to the maintenance of a spotless name. The young men of Japan were taught that the greatest honor is to die for the emperor. Additionally, the Japanese were taught it was ignominy to surrender to the enemy. The combined effect of these two precepts was to inculcate in the Japanese soldier a spirit of contempt for the Allied soldiers who surrendered, which, in defiance of the rules of war, was demonstrated in their ill treatment of prisoners. They made no distinction between the soldier who fought honorably and courageously up to the inevitable surrender and the soldier who surrendered without a fight. All enemy soldiers who surrendered under any circumstance were to be regarded as being disgraced and entitled to live only by the tolerance of their captors. Surrender was unforgivable under their code, drilled into them through the Imperial Japanese education system and military. When the Japanese would come across vast swaths of the enemy surrendering, particularly if the enemy had used up all of their ammunition killing their comrades, and then surrendering, well, it added fuel to their barbarity. One only needs to look at the deaths due to banzai charges. Take, for example, the incredible massive one that happened at the Battle of Saipan, seeing around 40,000 dead Japanese. RGA officers brought ancestral katanas to the war. The Japanese would cut off the heads of their enemies, as it was seen to be honorable. When faced with death, many chose to commit seppuku. The Bushido propaganda was so intense. A brutal practice emerged in the Pacific Island hopping campaign, whereupon wounded Japanese would pretend to be dead or that they were surrendering, only to explode themselves using grenades upon Allied forces coming closer. This began to be noticed by U.S. Marines during the Battle of Guadalcanal and by Australians in the New Guinea campaign. Thus began a vicious cycle of violence. There were, of course, Japanese who would surrender, though rare. Hell, the Koreans forced into service would often be those wanting to surrender. But they would all be hampered by something. Because of the actions of those Japanese feigning their deaths and taking down Allied soldiers with them, the Allied soldiers gradually began a practice of not bothering to accept surrender. The old shoot first, ask questions later was kind of created here. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many Japanese made the Allies believe all they could expect was a grenade death, thus the Allies became more brutal to them. This simply led the Japanese to conclude their government was accurate about how the Allies would treat them, so more and more did not surrender. It was an absolutely horrible cycle that went on to the very end of the war, though the Allies did figure out means to get the Japanese to surrender during the last year. And now we have come to the last one, number 5, the brutality of the Japanese military. I think this is probably one of the most important factors. It also is the one most normies would not know too much about. The Imperial Japanese military, more so the army, had what I can only describe as a built-in system of abuse. As described to me by the same university professor I just keep bringing up in these podcasts, picture a literal pecking order, going from the very highest ranked generals to the very bottom grunt. Imagine each one who is higher than the other routinely physically abuses them. For example, it was very typical for a colonel to slap a major across the face. The major would then strike one of his captains, and the abuse would continue through the ranks to the grunts, who would have no one else to abuse. Thus, they turned to POWs or civilians. This was not just an accepted part of the IGA, it was indoctrinated. From day one of basic training, IGA officers taught their men races like the Chinese were their blood enemies and racially inferior to them. These were people the Japanese would rule over one day. The trainers would toss the boys into rigorous training activities involving physical violence towards another, alongside the notion any orders given by high-ranking officers was infallible, should be treated as if the divine emperor himself was giving those orders. The Japanese army even taught methods of torture that would be employed in all areas they occupied. Among these tortures were the water treatment, burning, electrical shocks, the knee spread, suspension, kneeling on sharp instruments, and flogging. The Kempeitai were the ones doing the lion's share of these tortures. Other army and naval units, however, used the same methods as the Kempeitai. Camp guards performed similar methods. Local police forces organized by the Kempeitai in occupied territories also applied the same methods of torture. The Kempeitai were administered by the War Ministry, trained at specialized schools, who were maintained and operated by the War Ministry in Japan. Thus, the conduct of the Kempeitai and the camp guards directly reflected the policy of the War Ministry. The Japanese army leadership made sure recruits were physically and mentally abused. They were given strenuous duty tasks and pushed to the absolute limit. Corporal punishment was a regular occurrence. You would be flogged for just about anything you did. During the war, given where they were deployed, take Guadalcanal for example, the Japanese soldiers would be facing starvation as well. Being half-starved, beaten, and suffering the effects of just war would drive anyone to perform horrifying acts. The life of a Japanese soldier was simply at the whims of an extremely toxic management culture. The lowest-ranking echelons received the lion's share of abuse, and they would take out their frustration on whomever they could find deemed lower than them, POWs, civilians, and such. Hell, the Korean workers that were attached to most IGA units, they were always beaten up. They were beaten up so much that for those that surrendered to the Americans, they would often gleefully ask if they could bury the dead Japanese and spit on their graves. There are many accounts of this in the Solomon Islands campaign, for example. So you have to imagine, if you are a grunt in the IGA or a low-ranking officer, your training and time spent in the military sees you getting physically abused by all of those above you, and then you are forced to do horrible duties, needlessly, and usually are beaten for them. An absolute barbaric culture of corporal punishment is dished out intentionally to harden the men by just physically abusing them over and over again. All of these variables combined contributed to the creation of a military willing to perform just about any atrocity they thought was necessary to win the war. It was a war they could not hope to win, but many of them went to their deaths trying to defeat the hands of fate. There are countless other reasons, of course, for the atrocities committed in cold or hot blood. Countless books have been written on the subject, and please do check out the few that I mentioned. They're all pretty good. With that all said and done, I want to give a big thanks to all of you Patreons. You guys are awesome. Please let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments on the Patreon. I want to hear more from you. What do you want to hear more about in the future? This has been the Pacific War Channel, over and out.